So, right about now, it's time for our radical military history examination. And Mike today wants to talk to us about the Port Chicago disaster.
A lot of the rebellions and mutinies and acts of resistance by U.S. service members that we're going to be talking about on this show, a large number of them have to do with resisting U.S. wars. But that's not always what leads to mutinies and rebellions in the military. And many times they're actually about racism and working conditions. Such was the case in July of 1944. The World War II, of course, was raging. And we know that African-American service members were really put in roles that were the hard labor roles, the jobs that no one else wanted to do because they weren't considered good enough to do anything else. This was what African-American soldiers were sentenced to. And so one of these jobs was working stateside at a place called Port Chicago in California, loading all of the munitions onto ships to go off and be used in the fighting in World War II. Now, this is extremely dangerous, high-skill work to be loading munitions onto ships that are, bombs that are meant to blow up whole parts of cities. But that didn't matter to the white officers who were in command of these all-black port loading crews of U.S. Navy sailors. In fact, they were forcing them to go as fast as possible in this loading. And it was even discovered afterwards that the white officers were placing bets on each other's teams that they were commanding. And so if one junior officer's team loaded faster than the other one, he got a bunch of money. So behind the scenes, while they're, for lack of a better term, whipping these people into loading bombs as fast as they possibly can, they're trading money behind the scenes, making a game out of it. That culminated with what was called the Port Chicago disaster, where because of working them in crazy long shifts, and because they were forcing them to work as fast and unsafely as possible, there is an explosion on one of the ships. And it was an absolute disaster. 320 people were killed, mostly black sailors in the Navy. 320. I mean, it's one of the hidden casualties of World War II. They're not considered part of World War II casualties, although they absolutely should be. So 320 were killed. And after they were killed, of course, the politicians said, well, there should be compensation to the families of those that were killed in this disaster. And so they offered something like $5,000 per family who had someone killed. When they found out that the vast majority of victims were black, they downgraded that amount by like 80% or something. And so families just got a fraction of what they would have gotten if the people were white. But as a result, right after that disaster happened, they ordered people to keep loading the ships with the same practices and with the same speed. On one of these at Port Chicago, all of these black sailors who had just known about this massive disaster where 320 of their brothers were killed, they're told to do the same thing. And you know what they did is they refused to do it. 258 African-American sailors refused to load the ammunition. Now, I want you to think about that number, right? I mean, this isn't just a spontaneous act of rebellion. I mean, think of the organization and the leadership and the communication, all the things that had to happen to get 300 sailors on the same page to conduct an illegal act. And of course, mutiny is punishable by death. So the people that took part in this strike, this really you could call it a strike versus a mutiny, they knew that they were facing very serious consequences, but they refused. Of course, they were threatened. They were told that they're going to go to jail. They were told that they could be executed. But in the meetings that they had amongst themselves, the self-organizing they did, they decided that they were all together, not going to load the ships until there is a proper safety measures put into place to prevent another disaster. Of course, the white officers didn't think it would be a big deal if there was another disaster, another 300 black sailors got killed. And these black sailors knew that, and they organized amongst themselves to save their lives. Of course, eventually they were all put on trial. They were all court-martialed. 50 of the people were identified as the leaders of the mutiny. They became known as the Port Chicago 50. So 50 out of the 300 were identified as the leaders and central organizers. A really incredible act of organizing. They tried to give them life in prison, but they sentenced them to something like 15 years of hard labor. Of course, the next year they were acquitted, which was a great thing, and it took a struggle to get them acquitted. But it shows that when you're in a position where you know that your life is being callously treated by officers who don't care anything about you, which was the case here and is the case on the battlefield in Iraq and Afghanistan or anywhere else, they realized that they had the power to change it. and that if they organized together and they collaborated together and they all stood on the same page, that they could stop another disaster from happening. And they did it. And knowing the consequences, they still did it. And because the struggle continued around them, all of them got out of jail. All of them were safe. And it was a major, major victory for the black sailors and was an example to the rest of the military.
For me, despite all of that, one of the most telling aspects is that even though they originally, they 15 years prison, hard labor, dishonorable discharge, when they were released, after they completed their service time, they were still given general under honorable conditions discharges. They weren't even given their honorable. So it goes to show you that despite them winning their trial, they still weren't given the best possible outcome in terms of discharge characterization, obviously because they were black and obviously because they resisted military orders. And so James Baldwin in The Fire Next Time has, I think, an important commentary on the role of black soldiers in World War II. And World War II in general, particularly in the United States, has this hero narrative to it that, the United States came in and saved the day from everyone. But it's a little bit more complicated than that. And Baldwin says that white people were and are astounded by the Holocaust in Germany. They did not know that they could act that way. But I very much doubt whether black people were astounded, at least in the same way. For Baldwin, the treatment accorded to black people during the Second World War marks for him a turning point in the black person's relation to America. He says, to put it briefly, and somewhat too simply, a certain hope died, a certain respect for white Americans faded. And he goes on to, discuss various situations in World War II where black GIs were accused of rape, were accused of other crimes, slandered, and they faced, punishment similarly to the Port Chicago 50. And this ties in then to how we should really view World War II is that in Donnie Gluckstein's book called The People's History of the Second World War, he articulates that World War II has a dual character to it. And that, yes, the fighting on the ground itself was a radical anti-fascist struggle. But the Allied governments were far more interested in creating a new order to suit their interests. And what kind of expresses this, for example, in the UK, Churchill praised Mussolini when he first came to power. And though he disliked Hitler, he viewed the Soviet Union and his fear of, the quote-unquote Bolsheviks, usually for someone like him, a dog whistle for some other type of anti-Semitic conception of communism. But he despised the Soviet Union far more than the Nazis, as did the United States and France. And until the Nazis started threatening their own interests on a larger scale, they really kind of allowed them to rise. And plenty of people have heard the stories of, Jewish refugees trying to escape to America and being turned away. And so this particular moment, the Port Chicago disaster, goes to show that even if strategically the United States was fighting against the Nazis and Imperial Japan, the United States, the UK, France, the Allies in general were resolving their own fascist tendencies within their own borders, their own structural issues, which could have, and in many ways has, laid the groundwork for fascism to arise there. We all know, again, after the Second World War, the United States did not hesitate to recruit former Nazis into its ranks for various scientific programs, enterprises, Operation Paperclip, as it's known. And so, again, the nations fought over imperial gain, but it was the people on the ground who fought the ideological struggle against fascism. And you need look no further than the betrayal of Polish, Greek, and Italian anti-fascist movements, as well as the Soviet Union in general, by the Allies, specifically the US, UK, and France, to see the true motivations and aspirations of the great powers. And again, the Soviet Union was part of the Allied powers, but as soon as World War II ended, you see this pivot. And of course, we lead into the Cold War. But again, we need to critically re-examine a lot of these national narratives we're fed at a young age because, as I stated in the last episode, history is the fruit of power. And we're taught at a young age to view the Second World War as this triumphant moment for the United States and becoming the world, leader and this, international hero. But it's far more complicated. And whether you were one of those groups I mentioned betrayed by the U.S. after the war, or you were a U.S. soldier yourself, you have a very different relationship. And I think that those who constituted the Port Chicago 50 would take much issue with how the American role in the Second World War is portrayed.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, the Port Chicago strike or the Port Chicago mutiny really was a catalyst for other similar incidents that happened in 1944 during World War II, really heroic actions by Black soldiers, of course, that we'll get into in future installments of Radical Military History. For example, there was Black soldiers rioted in Guam on a naval base in 1945. 1,000 African-American sailors staged a hunger strike at their base in California to protest discriminatory conditions. So there's a rich history there. And I wanted to conclude this part by saying that in the 1990s, Congress decided they wanted to posthumously pardon all of the members of the Port Chicago 50 because, enough time had passed where they didn't have to punish them anymore. And it was long known that what they did was heroic and right. When they tried to pardon them posthumously, one of the few surviving members of the Port Chicago 50 is a man named Freddie Meeks, and he refused the pardon. He said that a pardon is for a guilty person asking for forgiveness. And he was maintaining that we were not guilty, we did what was right, and he was standing by it and didn't want the government's petty pardon so many years later. And he said, quote, "I hope that all of America will know about it because it's something that's been in the closet for so long." And so that's why we wanted to highlight this story today in honor of Freddie Meek and all of the Port Chicago 50 and the close to 300 sailors that participated in that mutiny and the 320 African-American sailors who were killed because of some white officers' incompetence and mistreatment of them. And in the spirit of Freddie Meeks, who still maintains that what they did was right, you would also be right for doing something similar to the Port Chicago 50. Whenever you see your life is in danger because of the ridiculous orders of incompetent officers, you have to realize that there was only just a couple of them, and you're the one that drives everything. And if all of you get together, you can very quickly stop things in its tracks and demand that it change.